Welcome to today's Religion Media Centre briefing, which is on the report by Professor Alexis Jay on the future of safeguarding in the Church of England. It's hard-hitting. It lifts the lid on, I think it would be right to say, chaotic bureaucracy in the Church of England, and it concludes that the shortcomings of current safeguarding arrangements are so widespread and ingrained that there is a collapse of confidence and a complete change of culture is required. Principally, that it concludes that there should be 2 new charities to oversee and scrutinise safeguarding. And joining us to discuss the report's findings are the Bishop of Birkenhead, Julie Connolty, the Deputy Lead Bishop for Safeguarding with a focus on survivor engagement, the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, a member of the Archbishop's Council, Andrew Greystone, an advocate for the survivors of church abuse, Jane Chavuz, co-founder of Survivors' Voices, and Justin Humphreys, CEO of 31H, which is a Christian organisation dealing with safeguarding. So thank you all for joining at such short notice. And some of our guests have limited time, so we'll try to get you in first. And we'll start with you, Bishop Julie. The archbishops have welcomed this report. They've welcomed the scrutiny and the challenge. Do you agree?
I do agree, yes. It feels a long time coming, actually. And for me, I think the one and really helpful thing that came out of the whole crisis that I think we faced at the point of disbandment of the ISB is that it felt like we were at a really critical sea change moment. And for me, this report in particular is setting out the way we need to go. So I do welcome it. That's not unqualified. I've got some questions about things within it. And I think there's an awful lot of work to do. But that we need truly independent oversight of safeguarding and delivery of safeguarding, I think is absolutely clear.
It paints a very sorry picture of the bureaucracy within the Church of England. In particular, it lists 7 things that have gone wrong in the system, the process. The collapse of confidence, inconsistent safeguarding practice, inequity in funding amongst the dioceses, data collection, I may as well read the whole list, definitions of safeguarding that differ, inappropriate use of safeguarding resources, and lack of independent scrutiny. How did the Church of England allow itself to get into this state?
Partly by being complex, by not being a single organisation. I would query some aspects of this. I was quite interested around the definition because when you read the accompanying legal paper, it talks about the advantages of the fact that the Church of England has a slightly wider definition around vulnerability of adults and that we need to attend to adults who fall outside the usual statutory definition with regard to safeguarding. So even within the Jay report and accompanying legal advice, there are some things there that the nuance of which you might miss in just reading the headlines. So yes, we have opted to have a different definition. There are disadvantages to that. There are also advantages to that in terms of making our churches safer places. So the complexity around it. But is there a problem? There is a problem overall. Is there an issue with our governance structures? Yes. Does this need sorting out? Yes.
So just to put some detail on this problem about definition of safeguarding, it mentions people who've been involved in extramarital affairs who are regarded as a safeguarding risk, someone who was on a duty on a feed bank as a safeguarding risk, and that it was weaponised by diocesan leaders to get rid of clergy and volunteers. What do you think of this charge that it's been weaponised by the church? How could that possibly happen?
I'm uncomfortable with the term weaponised, I must admit, because that's very loaded. I'm not saying it never happens, but it is very loaded. But I think what the bigger issue, that's a really significant issue, is something I would call creep. And creep is where the definition of safeguarding starts to become so broad that it sweeps up all sorts of HR issues. And I think Professor Jay picks up on this as well, which are better dealt with in other processes. And it is a real art and a skill to define how you triage all of this and get people into the right bit of a complicated world. where you've got to decide whether bullying has taken place. If it's bullying, has it reached a threshold that needs to be dealt with through safeguarding? Or was it better dealt with through a normal policy around management of volunteers or an HRM policy around employees? So there is a real issue about definitions and triage, and a good diocesan safeguarding team will work extremely well collaboratively with HR, with church councils, with other departments in a diocese in order to navigate this well. The weaponizing thing, I think it does happen. I think people think that if they attach a safeguarding label to something, they will get a result and attention that they would not otherwise get. But if we just say, oh, that's weaponizing, we might be missing something really important, perhaps about bullying or harassment or safeguarding. So I think we just have to be a bit careful with the use of the label.
Let's move on to its criticism of the bishops. It says that in all the dioceses, there are different people that the safeguarding officers are answerable to. In some cases, it's one case is registrar, other cases a diocesan secretary, sometimes the bishop. And there was one quote, one diocesan registrar described the power that bishops still have around safeguarding as slightly horrifying. That there's too much power amongst the bishops and that safeguarding should be taken out of your hands. Do you agree with that?
To some extent, it has been taken out of our hands. So the new definition of diocesan safeguarding officers, the power that they have, the role that they will have, the influence they will have within case management groups. I mean, this is a very different world to 5 years ago in terms of where the power lies. And in the best dioceses, the best examples, you can see that in the way that safeguarding professionals are respected and that they very much are the people leading on this. And yes, a case management group may bring other perspectives and questions and challenges, but ultimately they are the ones in the driving seat. And that is, I think, increasingly the practice. But inevitably, bishops do have a responsibility around leadership and about leading good safeguarding culture in a diocese. So we have to be a little careful here because it'd be easy to say, well, it's not us, it's the safeguarding officers, and then duck our responsibility to lead the change that is needed. So we've got to sort of hold that in balance. I think there have been difficult situations and cases where we've got this wrong in the past. I think we're on the right track, and I hope what Professor Jay proposes will get us further along the road where bishops are, yes, leading a positive culture, but not overriding safeguarding professionals, which I think is mainly a thing of the past, but probably hasn't gone completely.
Right, so you're the Deputy Lead Bishop for Safeguarding with a focus on survivor engagement. And the report said that there was a collapse of confidence, particularly amongst survivors in the current system. What confidence can you give survivors, some of whom may be on this call, that they will be able to trust the system in the future if these recommendations are implemented?
Tricky one. If they're implemented as outlined in Professor Jay's report, then there should be some confidence simply in that this looks like a much more truly independent model than we have ever had before. And if the Church of England governance around safeguarding and structures are not working, then hopefully these proposals will deliver something that will work so much better. Can I promise you it'll be perfect? No, I can't. And we've yet to see how this fleshes out, what the detail and the timescale will be. And there are questions about that, absolutely. So this is not a moment to walk away and say, okay, job done, all sorted, let's just wait. We need to keep working to try to make sure we get the best out of these proposals.
Thank you. I'd like to move now to Justin Humphreys. Justin, thank you for joining us in between all your meetings today. You're the CEO of 31H, and there's no clue in the title, but it's a Christian organisation dealing with safeguarding. And I know that you deal with churches, all kinds of churches and church organisations, Christian organisations. Have you ever seen anything like a report like this, which is damning about the way that the process works in the Church of England, anything comparable in any other denomination?
Thanks. Firstly, perhaps to speak to 31:8 and what sits behind that. It's from Proverbs 31:8, which is speak on behalf of the voiceless and for the rights of all who are vulnerable. So it underpins all the work that we do across the church and elsewhere. Hark that. To respond specifically to your question, no, I've not seen anything quite like this anywhere before. And I think that's really why it speaks to the huge opportunity that it presents to the Church of England and presents to the church at large, frankly, to be thinking about, well, what does independence mean? How do we ensure that complex structures have robust and consistent systems, processes that genuinely safeguard all, whether visibly vulnerable or not, and we may need to come back to that particular issue. But in working across the church, we see a variety of different arrangements in place, which largely are versions of the same types of arrangements. Churches and denominations and networks are always incredibly complex in the way that they're structured and constituted. But generally, the mechanisms look the same. And therefore, many of them are probably experiencing the same challenges that the Church of England is facing now and has been for quite some time. I've often thought to some degree that it's a little bit unfair that the Church of England comes in for all the stick on these issues, because perhaps it is the easy target, but perhaps it has the biggest challenges. So it's not unique.
Can we just look at what it recommends, which is these two new charities that it wants to be set up, which will be independent? The charities will be funded by the Church of England. One will oversee the process. The other will oversee the scrutiny. Will that work?
That's the $1,000,000 question as far as I'm concerned. 31:8 are very much supportive of this report, the process, the journey that is now required. I have made my public views on external scrutiny known very clearly already in my evidence to the independent inquiry. I believe that external, truly and fully independent scrutiny and support is absolutely critical. It's a sad fact that the Church of England has been unable to make itself accountable sufficiently. And it's now time for that to happen in a different way. As far as the recommendation around Organisation A is described in the report, I have much deeper questions about that and whether, in fact, that is a possible model. And my main question around this is the mantra that we all use and have been using for many years in relation to safeguarding is that safeguarding is everyone's business or everyone's responsibility. So if we're taking the operational responsibility and activities of safeguarding out of the Church of England, is there a risk that that actually undermines the need to embed in our cultures it being everyone's responsibility? So I, for one, would be very much looking forward to more clarity on how that might work on the ground, the relationships between Organisation A and its staff and others in situ, within dioceses, within parishes, so that we're not unwittingly creating disconnects that actually take us potentially into a worse position than we currently are. There's some big questions for me around that.
The current model is all based on volunteers, correct me if I'm wrong, volunteers in the parish. Each diocese has a different way of doing things. And what this new proposal recommends is more uniformity across the piece.
Yes.
What have you seen in the way that the dioceses have been dealing with safeguarding that has given you cause for concern? And what can you tell us about whether the same people involved in safeguarding in the diocese will be simply transferred into the new system?
perhaps I'd just like to start by saying that the vast majority of safeguarding staff within the diocese are doing an excellent job in very, very challenging circumstances. There have been few occasions where we've had genuine concern about practice and the way things are managed. So I think it's important to make that point. It is not the staff on the ground as much as it is that the structures within which they are expected to work that has been the problem. So there are undoubtedly some issues and some pockets where questionable practice takes place. We talked already about the weaponizing of safeguarding, and Julie, I would agree with you. I really dislike the term, but I think we know what we mean when we refer to that. And that has been something which has taken place, that safeguarding procedures have been used unhelpfully when actually probably HR and disciplinary processes were much more fitting. So I think there's a range of concerns for me around some of that. Sorry, what was the second part of the question, Ruth?
Will the diocesan staff be transferred to the new systems? It's said in the report that they hope that some would, or people would. Didn't give a figure on it. I'm just wondering if that would satisfy complaints and concerns that people have had about the way the process works at the moment. But you're saying it's process, not people.
Well, largely, I would say it's process, not people. I'm not saying that there aren't people problems that could potentially be solved, but largely, I think process. And I don't reading the legal advice attached to Professor Jay's report, which in itself is fairly substantial, 30-odd pages in itself, spells out the possibilities for the staffing arrangements of the new entities. Talks about TUPE transfers and what have you. Now, that may well be a good thing, and I think if some of the good, if not best practice can be maintained and transferred into whatever the new arrangements are going to be, then that's got to be a good thing and in the interests of everyone concerned. There's no question about that. I think one of the major challenges that we've seen with the NST and to some extent with some diocesan teams is that the loss of long-term corporate memory, the turnover of staff has been incredible at times, to the point where we as an external organisation have had to tell members of NST and others why things are the way they are, because they really don't know, because they've only been around 2 years. So I think there's something really important about maintaining what does work well and not unwittingly destroying it in the pursuit of a totally different model.
Thank you. I know you've got to go to another meeting, but stay with us as long as you can. Can I go to the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul now? Ian, you're a member of the Archbishop's Council. I wonder if you could explain to us where the blame lies for this fault within the Church of England over safeguarding. Does it lie with the House of Bishops or does it lie with the Archbishop's Council?
Well, Ruth, I'm really fascinated that you couch the conversation in where does the blame lie? And I think that illustrates one of the problems with this, which is that the debate has become completely toxic. I think some of both the approaches or the briefing that Baroness Jay was given and the outcomes of it, and some of the issues that, for instance, Justin has raised, I think indicate some of the problems there. In terms of the briefing, I was really struck at the very beginning where she says in the report, I'm not looking at options. I'm saying I've been told that I need to give not whether we should, but how we set up these two independent charities. And I think that illustrates one of the issues at the heart of this, which is that Archbishop Justin, I think, has failed to distinguish between do we have independent safeguarding or do we have independent scrutiny for safeguarding? And I know that some of the people who are involved in it are very unhappy that the Jay report has not considered some of the possible alternative models and which ones are going to be most fit for purpose. But we are where we are and the report is there. And I don't think we'll have any choice but to implement it. But I have to say there are some positive things about it and some things in the report that I welcome, not only as a member of the Archbishop's Council, but also as a clergyman myself and talking to other clergy. I mean, I think one of the things that I value is the fact that the report has highlighted how dissatisfied victims are with the current processes, but alongside that has also highlighted how dissatisfied those who've been accused, often wrongly accused. And this whole thing about, I know Julie wanted to use the word creep rather than weaponizing, but the real difficulty here is it, and this is something I've experienced personally as well, having been subjected to what I would regard as a vexatious safeguarding complaint, is that for someone whose livelihood, family life, home is vulnerable to an accusation, which in a number of cases have been handled really, really badly. When I had to face at 4 hours' notice what I regard as a vexatious complaint, I came out of the meeting, and the first question I asked the person who had accompanied me was, what is my life going to look like now after ministry? And the lack of confidence, both from victims on the one hand, but also from those who've been accused, is really serious. And that's why I'm not unhappy with the word weaponizing, because that's certainly what it feels like. But there are other things that I think are positive about the report, is that because the subject has become so toxic, so for example, members of staff in the National Safeguarding Team, and the report was actually positive. The report recognised that at the centre of the church, there have been serious attempts to address this issue. But at every turn, the whole issue becomes weaponised. And so we're just overwhelmed. I mean, the reason why there's a turnover of staff at the centre is because staff have been subjected to so much abuse. And that's a real issue here. The issue has become so toxic. And it seems to me that the recommendations that the report is making are the only way out of it, the only way to have a clean sheet and to say, look, we want to focus not on who is to blame, where the problem is. I think it is structural. One of the things we found extremely frustrating as an Archbishop's Council is putting in place central measures, but we do not have jurisdiction over the 42 dioceses. The bishops in the diocese are, as it were, kings in their own castle. And again, one of the immensely helpful things about the report is highlighting the inconsistency of practice, of investment, of policy, even from one diocese to another. And without some kind of more centralised system, I don't see how we're ever going to get away from that.
So you think it's inevitable, though you don't like it very much. I'm just wondering what lessons you think.
Well, I think there are some difficulties about the way it was set up, and the fact that the brief was given was to say we must go independent, end of, rather than actually having a more nuanced consideration of some of the issues, for instance, that Justin Humphreys has raised. But given that that's the report we've got, I don't really see how we can't implement it, because if anybody raises these questions, then there's going to be immediate pushback saying, oh, you don't accept it. I mean, already I read this today on a blog of someone who has been a prominent person who resigned from Synod, using the report to blame the Archbishop's Council again. I think if that's the way the report is going to be used, we're still stuck in the same position. We've got to move on and say, is this something we can implement? Yes, there are going to be questions. Yes, there are going to be serious questions asked. And the questions at the end that the report asks are ones that we're going to have to really engage with. But unless we can actually put this and have an independent process and follow these recommendations, I think the blame game is just going to continue, and it's not going to get us anywhere.
So what lessons have you learned as a member of the Archbishop's Council through this?
Personally, I would say that I've certainly wanted an independent process, that the Archbishop's Council has always wanted an independent process. One of the things that we were extremely frustrated by the so-called Independent Safeguarding Board is, again, the report notes quite explicitly that the interim Independent Safeguarding Board, which was not independent, it was never claimed to be independent, one of the goals, one of the tasks for that was to recommend a way forward for independent scrutiny or safeguarding. And we were very frustrated that that wasn't happening after 2 years, which is why a year ago, December, I said, look, this isn't working. We've got to find a different way to move to truly independent safeguarding. I think this has become a very, very painful route to it. But it seems to me that this report has brought that prospect of truly independent scrutiny of church being safeguarding closer. And although it's been a very painful process, I, for one, and I think the rest of the Archbishop's Council are also very pleased that we're going to we're brought at least one major step closer to that.
Thank you. And I bring in Andrew Greystone now. Andrew, you're an advocate for survivors of church abuse. I want to give you the chance to respond to what the earlier speakers have said on the call, but your quick reaction to the report. Was there anything in this that surprised you?
Not really, because it comes in a long context. Those of us who've been involved with this work over 10 years or so have have been pointing out the kind of weaknesses that Professor Jay has isolated all the way along. And the core there are a number of weaknesses. One is, of course, the complexity of the church, which Bishop Julie has talked about. Another core weakness that I think is becoming evident here is the sense that the church knows, that the people at the centre of the church know how to do this stuff. And the reality is they don't, because they're not experts in safeguarding kind of leadership or management. They're experts in a lot of other things. And so we need to have this kind of full independence, both in terms of operation and scrutiny, because we need people with real expertise making the decisions. Now, my worry is that within hours of this report being published, the church published its response, which said, the people who are going to look at this and consider it are, and then there's a long list of basically all the same people who got us into this mess in the first place. Now, how are those people who have proven not to be able to run safeguarding effectively and whose relationships with victims and survivors are completely broken, how are those people supposed to win the trust of victims and survivors that they're going to manage the process any better going forward? So I think that the report itself is strong. The church's pushback at 10 o'clock this morning looked like a slap down and has caused a lot of anxiety amongst people I'm in touch with.
I do understand what Andrew's saying there. And I was talking to somebody, another advocate this morning. One of the dilemmas I face is, in order to effect change, we need the people who can pull the strings, who have the power. And Andrew's absolutely right. Some of those people were involved in the decision to disband the ISB and the decisions around how it was disbanded. And so that is a very difficult thing for survivors to trust. So I don't think I'm disagreeing with Andrew, but I haven't seen a better model in terms of, we do need certain people around that table to make this happen.
Well, we do, but I think the better model involves having a scrutiny panel, an oversight panel of independent experts who will audit the process of the implementation of this huge change. We need to maybe ask Professor Jay to oversee the process, or ask the lawyer who gave her legal advice to oversee it. There needs to be some body of people with expertise and independence from the church who can say to survivors and to ordinary church members who are so distressed by all this stuff, who can say to them, we can assure you that this is being done right. If, as seems to be proposed at the moment, it is done by the same people behind the cloak of secrecy, the same lawyer who set up the Independent Safeguarding Board is apparently going to advise on the setting up of this new body, the same chief executive, the same people are not going to produce a new relationship and a trauma-informed and safeguarding aware structure.
Thank you. I could see Jane Chavuz there nodding away as you were speaking. Jane, would you like to come in on this? You're the co-founder of Survivors' Voices. Perhaps the first question should be, what have survivors been saying to you this morning since the report was published?
I think there's a huge sense of relief that not unexpectedly, the report has come out firmly for complete independence. So while recognising some of the issues that Dustin talked about, I think all the survivors that I know have longed for a completely independent process, because, as the report makes clear, trust and confidence in the church to discharge its safeguarding responsibilities well has broken down for some time. And in my experience of the last 4 years in particular, it's actually getting worse rather than better. despite the best efforts, as we've already said, of a lot of people who do bring a lot of commitment and professional expertise, but the system and processes and the mistakes of the past have made it impossible. So I think this is the only way forward, a completely independent safeguarding body.
Are you concerned at all, though, with the time that this will take to set up 2 new charities and new systems and engage the right staff? I mean, you've already got a backlog of cases. What will happen to that?
Oh, totally. And there has, we have to avoid the kind of planning blight situation, don't we, that local authorities often face, that nothing happens while we're waiting for the new thing to happen that is better than the current thing. There has to be some business as usual in transition, and transition has to be managed well. And so we've been waiting far too long for this. Survivors needed this to happen 20 years ago, and some of us have been campaigning and trying to effect change for 20, 30 years, and we're exhausted. And ground down to the, for example, the 11, I'm one of them whose cases were dropped without any consideration on the sacking of the ISB, are still waiting for anything to be done to progress our cases. So I've had a lot of distressed people contacting me today. Actually, not just there's been celebration of a firm move to an unequivocal move to independence, but a lot of distress that we've waited so long, and these are significant implementation challenges. So we are going to have to wait longer. But as I think it was said by in the Wilkinson report, it is possible to do things in a timely fashion as well as do them well, and so I think it can be done.
I am glad that there are survivors who see this as a really significant moment, a turning point, and a positive way forward. And one of my concerns actually around the Jay report is, although you can see in the legal advice that the suggestion is that survivors might be involved in appointing trustees to these 2 new bodies, I'm less clear as to how we keep survivors at the centre in the new model. So that's a concern for me, and I think it's a concern for some survivors, because the Church of England's been doing lots of work, we've not got there yet, but on consultation and widening that consultation and exploring what co-production means. And I don't see that embedded in the Jay recommendations, but of course it's how you implement things, not just the implementation that's important. So we do need to make sure we work with survivors, and they are proposed as members of this responding group. We do need to make sure we keep them at the centre of what we're doing and feed that into whatever the independent bodies are somehow. To respond to Jane, Jane and I talk about this on and off. You're right, Jane, we haven't got there in terms of delivering what the 11 all need, not because we haven't consulted and put some stuff in place, but because I don't think we've nailed the right solution yet. And I am concerned that we seem a bit locked in that position of saying this is the offer, and a number of survivors saying this offer doesn't work for us, and that not enough attention is paid to resolving that. So that there are some issues here, that the 11 were called absolutely in this disbandment of the ISB, which did huge damage to them. And of course, other survivors were impacted. It went like a wave through the survivor community and impacted people differently, depending upon how they related to the ISB and their experience of the church. I mean, this isn't one sort of group that are all the same. But we're still not there, I think, in mending the harm. And I don't quite know how we get there, but I do want to continue those conversations. I think we need to pick that up. And I'm sure that will come out at General Synod this week.
I think I entirely agree with Julie. And I think I think one of the big questions for me is, how do we find common cause? I mean, I agree with Jane. I mean, I think in the Archbishop's Council, one of the things I felt immensely frustrated by was that we'd employed people to be part of this interim independent safeguarding board. There were, as far as I understood it, 10 major cases they needed to review. We invested £740,000 in that process over 2 years. And in all that time, only one case was reviewed. Now, yes, there's a question about what were the mistakes we made in disbanding the ISB, but there was a much more fundamental one, which was why so little was being done, why so little was happening. It was our intention that that should happen. And again, I want to find common cause with Andrew on this and say, well, how do we implement it? And how do we implement Jay well? But one of the things that the Wilkinson report said was the problem with the ISB in the first place was that we rushed into providing a solution without thinking through the issues, and that embedded problems. So how do we avoid doing that again? I hear exactly what Jane says, and others have said, look, we can't suffer from planning blight. But the other thing that none of us want is to rush in to do this, to just implement it without thinking about it and not address the concerns that both Justin and Julie have raised. And we end up in a worse situation in a year or 2 years' time and frustrated. So I think I really want to say to Jane and to Andrew, certainly I think other members of the Archbishop's Council really want to find common cause and really want to work together on this and not lapse into this binary of us against them, which some people are already doing.
Nobody is going to accuse the Church of rushing into this.
Yeah,
well, that's exactly what the Wilkinson report said on the ISB. It was rushed into under pressure out of concern for the optics.
I was going to ask you, Ian, if you could give us some indication of time frame now, and then we'll take the questions in the chat box. But briefly, will this report come before this synod, or has it arrived too late for the February synod? Will it come up in July? What's the time frame that we're looking at here? Do you know?
Well, we committed to discussing this at this synod, and there's a slot put aside for it. So I think we must discuss at this synod. I mean, I don't think I can answer questions about the timetable from implementing because as Andrew said, I'm not a safeguarding expert, and I'm not aware of all the things that Justin has pointed out, all the details that I know Julie will master. But my concern will be I think now that we've got a report which says this is the route to go, I think we've got to go down this route. I think actually diocesan bishops will be relieved. I mean, when I talk to my diocesan episcopal colleagues, one of the things they say to me, I said, well, how's it going? Not many people say that to bishops. How's it going? And every single time I do that, every single bishop says, it's fine, but I'm overwhelmed with safeguarding issues. I'm overwhelmed with the bureaucracy. I'm overwhelmed with the vexatious cases. I'm overwhelmed with these things. And one of my hopes would be, if we, in implementing Jay, is that will take some of this terrible pressure off, because it'll and I think also it pulls out the issues about conflict of interest, which I think are massive as well, but for everybody involved in this. And if it relieves those two pressures, I think that'll be really worth shooting for.
Thank you. I would like to bring in a questioner now. Andrew Brown, you've put a question in the chat box. Would you like to ask it in person?
I'm just puzzled, have been for a long time. When people talk about safeguarding, the obvious meaning would be to prevent bad things happening in the future. You change the culture of the church, things like I go to a friend's daughter's christening and somebody says, oh, you can't take photographs. Well, that's an overreaction, but it's aimed, if you like, in the right direction. And almost all the fuss and almost all the rage and almost all the fuss and rage, I suppose, is about dealing with the consequences of abuse that happened a long time in the past. And it seems to me that these two things are separate and possibly require different kinds of treatment. And am I being naive?
No, I don't think that's naive at all. I think it's part of the complexity of the whole situation, part of the problem of definition that Alexis Jay raises. I would want to suggest that there are broadly three aspects of safeguarding that the church has to deal with. One is what you might call preventative safeguarding, making sure that as far as you possibly can, harm doesn't happen. And actually, in all honesty, for an extremely complex organisation like the Church of England, that is done pretty well on the whole. It's not very even, but broadly speaking, it's done pretty well. It needs professional assurance from the outside, and I hope that the new body will be able to give it that. But that's the one aspect. The second aspect, which is quite separate, you're right, Andrew, is what happens when things go wrong, as they inevitably will. Where do you go with an allegation of abuse and who deals with it, and what happens if you are the one who is alleged to have been an abuser. How is that process handled? And that is extremely complicated, well beyond the knowledge and understanding of most of the people who are trying to make these decisions. But it's a second separate aspect of it. And in the case of the Church of England, there's a third aspect as well, which is the historic safeguarding failures. People who have been victims of abuse in the past, because my second category involves, you mustn't think this is all in the past, Andrew, because I hear people every week of the year who have allegations of very recent safeguarding failures. But the third aspect for the Church of England is dealing with its legacy of unmet need amongst victims and survivors. And in many ways, that's a relatively simple thing to do. I mean, there are 50 or 100 people who need someone to go and sit down with them and listen to them and say, what do you need? What has happened to you, and how can it be dealt with? So there are those three aspects. The first one, preventative safeguarding, you're right, has to stay within the church itself, because preventative safeguarding is everybody's responsibility, but it does need assurance from an outside body.
I just want to say that it was an incredibly helpful summary from Andrew. And I think that distinction between those three aspects is really, really, really key. And we haven't been served well when they've been confused. I mean, I was just really cross at the July Synod when the ISB debacle broke out. And Archbishop Stephen said, safeguarding in the Church of England is in crisis. It isn't in crisis, because the ISB issues and around dealing with the past cases did not have a bearing on the first category, which Andrew said, which was the preventative safeguarding. We've got to make sure we're clear about these different issues. And I just thought, I think, Andrew, what you commented there was really, really, really helpful. And I agree with you about it has to belong in the church as a practice, but with external scrutiny. I worry that the Jay briefing said everything's got to be external has missed that point. But we need to bear that in mind as we go forward.
You say it's not in crisis, Ian. How can you say it's not in crisis when this report from Alexis Jay lists 7 key issues like inconsistent practice, inequity in funding, poor or absent data collection, different definitions of safeguarding? There's no system that's working in the Church of England. That's a crisis.
I'm not disputing that. I'm just simply picking up Andrew's language there, where he said that, he said that by and large, this is happening. And what we can't do is conflate the problems we've got with resolving the past history and simply then paint that across the whole church and say safeguarding is all in crisis, because actually in local churches, despite the inconsistencies in local churches, safeguarding is prominent. I think there are some practical issues around overreach and the bureaucracy, as you say. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think I'm picking up on Andrew's observation that these are different issues, and a crisis and a problem in one is a separate issue and needs dealing separately than some of the issues in the other. I don't dispute that there's plenty to do, and we need to take the whole Jay report very seriously.
I think this illustrates, in a way, something that's came out from both Jay and Wilkinson, is that the church doesn't have the resources and the expertise that it needs to implement this change on its own. And I share some of the concerns that other people that Andrew in particular raised about the current plan from the church to respond to this being too much an internal response group, and the people already being identified without due consultation and a transparent process of appointment. And Sarah Wilkinson recommended that external safeguarding experts be entrusted with the work of developing the detail of how anything that any new body, and I hope that synods will actually pick that up this Saturday in the debates and amend the proposal that's currently been put forward to ensure that yes, there needs to be church people with decision making ability within the response group, but it should be led by external safeguarding experts, and it should have a significant not just two people with no connected group. It should have a significant, properly resourced survivor voice, and recognise that there are survivors with considerable expertise. That, as the House of Survivors say, it's the survivors who hold the history of church safeguarding, not bishops, not safeguarding experts. It's us. So that needs to be part of the future. And the final thing I wanted a chance to say, which we haven't touched on, is, while 100% are pleased with the importance of independence, I think Jay does miss a trick in terms of recognising the faith context, and I'm disappointed that she wants to remove spiritual abuse, because some of us have worked very hard for a long time to get the understanding of spiritual abuse within faith-based safeguarding, and that's not just the church but across all faith groups. I'm part of the Violence Against Women and Girls Faith Coalition, and they've just published some guidance on understanding spiritual abuse for faith communities. So I hope that as the detail is further discussed, that we're able to deal properly with that issue. Thank you.
I think it is important to understand the J recommendations in their detail, and those questions about definition were not suggesting that we had different definitions in different dioceses. That's not my understanding at all. There is a standard set of definitions for the Church of England, which happens to differ around vulnerable adults to the standard definitions in legislation that local authorities work to, for example. And that is an issue, and we've talked about that. There is consistency of guidance, there is consistency of training, there is consistency of expectation about who will have DBS checks. There is a lot of consistency at the ground. Jay is addressing an issue of independence at the top and running through the centre right down to the diocese in terms of how we deliver proper independent scrutiny and how we deliver proper, supervised, overseen, professional safeguarding. And that's not because it's catastrophic on the ground in parishes. It's variable, but it will still be variable under the new model, nor is it because there is very poor safeguarding in diocesan safeguarding teams. That's not what she's saying at all. Yes, there is a question about resourcing for a complexity of reasons, some of which is simply, and she's right, that some dioceses under-resource safeguarding, and that is not right or effective. But sometimes it's the amount of legacy work that a diocese is wading through. That's certainly the case in my own diocese, which is why we're so highly resourced in this season and maybe for some time to come. So I think there are some complexities around this, but that is not to take away from the importance of these recommendations and the recognition that things need to change in terms of the way safeguarding is structured, the governance of safeguarding, and the independence, particularly the professionalism of safeguarding in the church.
Can I just ask you a question to draw this together at the end, Bishop, which is why does the Church of England find safeguarding so difficult when schools, universities can deal with this with multiple campuses? Is it a question that you want to protect the reputation of the church and there's a reluctance to pursue it? Or is it people are no good at administration? What's the reason?
I think there could be many reasons. I mean, one is we came to this later. I came into the church as a probation officer, and the world I worked in professionally when I was ordained was streets ahead. And the world of schools and colleges were way ahead, and health sector as well, from where the church was. We were sort of just beginning to grapple with some of this stuff. So some of this is that. I think there's an arrogance. That the church is in some way above normal rules or professional guidance. And I think we've had to deal with that and are still dealing with that. And there are some, as Jane has said, there are some really unique things about our faith context, as there are in other faith contexts, which need to be attended to. And sometimes we think that because we're unique, normal stuff doesn't apply, or other people don't get us when they try and explain to us what good safeguarding would be. We really need to have those dialogues and to tend to those gaps in understanding, and that will be true with new independent structures, is we have to attend to the gap between the external independent professional scrutiny and advice and the reality on the ground within churches and our own world in terms of how we use scripture, our theology, our power dynamics and structures. There are some things that are unique, but they do not get us out of jail free around safeguarding.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for taking part in the discussion today. And we'll keep an eye on it and probably draw you all together for another conversation in the future. Thank you very much for your time.